Hey everybody, Michael Park back with my second video tutorial in my basic training series on Trapcode Particular here at CreativeCow.net. Now, as I was watching TV the other day, I came across a movie that I really loved, which is the Stargate movie from 1994 starring James Spader and Kurt Russell, which spawned the TV series on Showtime, Stargate SG-1, which I also loved, with Richard Dean Anderson, aka MacGyver. And one of the cool things about that series was when they go through the Stargate, they go through this wormhole, and I'll show you the wormhole from the movie. This is from the 1994 film. And this in particular is what I want you to see. These stars, as they come across and you go through the wormhole, they kind of have this effect where they shoot away from the camera and then reverse course and come back towards the camera. And that's kind of the effect we want to recreate. As I was watching this, I thought, man, I think we can probably get something really close to that using Trapcode Particular inside of After Effects. Now, I'm always a little hesitant to show movies or kind of the inspiration clips when you're doing a video tutorial, especially one like this that's more of a basic training. The thing is, they take hundreds of man-hours and thousands of dollars to create these Hollywood effects. Now, I know this was 15 years ago, but still, there's a lot of time and effort went into creating this, and quite honestly, I don't have the same kind of resources or manpower to do that in a video tutorial. That being said, I think we can come pretty close to creating this using nothing but a PC, Trapcode Particular, and After Effects, and a little bit of know-how with the software. So I'm going to demonstrate how to get this effect using those tools. So we're going to hop back out of this and start in on a tutorial. The first thing we need to do is to create a new composition by choosing Composition, New Composition, or hitting Control-Y, and we'll call this Final Comp. I'm going to be working at a 2.35 to 1 aspect ratio at 800 by 340. It's pretty small, but it just is easier to do it at the screen resolution that we're capturing at, and also to keep up with the computer, have enough horsepower to do everything while recording. We're going to be using quite a bit of particles in this tutorial. I'm going to use a square aspect ratio, move down to a film frame rate, and a duration of 6 seconds will probably give us plenty of time. So let's click OK. Next thing I want to do is to create a new camera in our scene by choosing Layer, New Camera, and I'm going to use a 50mm preset and click OK. Also, we need a background or a solid layer to apply Trapcode Particular to, so let's choose Layer, New Solid, or hit Control-Y. And let's call this Particular Stars. And make sure it's comp size, the color doesn't matter, and click OK. Now, as I'm sitting here, I think I probably said hit Control-Y for new composition, and that's wrong. I was getting a little ahead of myself. You hit Control-N just to clear that up before I get anybody pointing that out in the comments section, which you would have a right to do because I was wrong. So hit Control-N for a new composition, Control-Y for a new layer, and let's move along. Okay, next thing we want to do is apply Trapcode Particular to our Particular Stars layer by choosing Effect, Trapcode Particular. And there we go. Let's go through the timeline. We have our basic default settings. Now, probably the first thing we need to do is talk a little bit about that sequence. So I'll just drag it in here real quick, and let's take another look at that. If we scrub through the timeline here till we see those stars, we basically have three separate sections that these stars are kind of making up. You've got this inner ring where the stars are shooting away from wherever they're being emitted from. Then you have this kind of middle zone where they slow down and kind of stop, and then they reverse course, creating this kind of outer vortex cone. And we're going to have to create that inside of After Effects using Trapcode Particular and using some forces applied to our particles. Now, in the fountain tutorial, the first tutorial in this series, I used gravity settings to bend the particles downward. And we're going to use some of the same principles and just do it over time or in motion, and also start adjusting some of the other parameters and getting a little more complicated. But it's really building off that first tutorial and the principles we learned there. Speaking of those forces, let's go ahead and take a look real quick at what we can use and what's inside of Trapcode Particular. If we come here to the Particle particular rollout here, we can twirl down the emitter, and what I'm going to do is set our direction here to directional instead of uniform. And I'm going to make these go up. So we're going to rotate these up, very similar to what we did in the fountain tutorial. Now let's twirl down here to our physics settings. And you can see that we have the gravity parameter, which we've already utilized in our first one, in the first tutorial. And then under air, we also have the wind, X, Y, and Z. And we can utilize those to push particles around as well. You increase the wind, they blow left, right, up and down with the Y, and back and forward with the Z. So that's another force that we can use if we needed to. Let's talk about the differences real quick. I'm going to turn my directional spread down to 0, and then turn my velocity random down to 0, so everything's the same velocity, and turn all these down. Okay, so let's look at the differences between gravity and wind, because I think there's one very important difference. As you can see, we have a velocity right now shooting particles up at 100, I guess that's pixels per second or something akin. Maybe it's just a random number, I don't know. But it's at a rate of 100. Now, if we turn up the gravity to 100, you can see that our emitter is right here in the middle. Our particles still shoot up, and then the gravity kind of takes hold of them and then pulls them straight down. So we have that look of the particles kind of escaping, and then the gravity affecting them like you would in the real world, and then kind of pulling them back down. But let's take a look at the wind real quick. Let's turn the gravity back down to 0, and the wind Y is what we want to look at. So we'll come down here to the timeline so we have some particles being emitted, and we'll start playing with the wind. If we turn the wind up to a higher number than 100, the particles go down. They don't actually go up at all, they just go straight down. If we turn this to exactly 100, which matches our velocity, and scrub through the timeline, they don't go anywhere, which means that the wind, unlike gravity, cancels out in a linear manner the velocity. So that means if you have the same velocity and the same wind, basically the particles are going to be stationary. Unlike the gravity, which is more of a exponential impact, which is like real gravity, if we twirl this up, you can see that we're still going to get some height out of our particles before gravity takes hold and starts pulling them down. And for our shot, this is important because we need the particles to shoot away, slow down, and then reverse course. So we're going to need to use gravity. Now, the reason why I talk about this is, number one, this is basic training in particular, but number two, we need to make sure that gravity comes back at the camera. And right now, the way this is, gravity doesn't have a vector. It always goes one way inside of Trapcode particular. So we need to do one of two things in order to have gravity come back towards the camera. We either need to rotate the camera so that gravity is now pointing towards the camera, so basically rotate the camera underneath, or we need to use the world transform here inside of particular to rotate the world around so that the gravity now comes towards us. So you need to rotate it 90 degrees. So those are the two ways that we can do it. I'm going to use the former way just because it makes more sense to me thinking about it instead of trying to think of everything rotated. So what I'm going to do is grab a new null object here and make it 3D, pick whip the, nope, not that, pick whip the camera to it, and then hit R to reveal the rotation. I'm just going to rotate this on the X axis to 90 degrees. And what should happen is the particles should shoot away from us and then come back. Alright, the next thing we need to do is to create a custom layer to shoot our particles out. By default, Trapcode Particular has a few different layer emitter settings, or I'm sorry, emitter type settings, which are point, which is from a single point, box, which is a volumetric emitter in the shape of a box that the user can define the size of, sphere, which is a volumetric setting that you can define the size of, that we used in the first tutorial as well, grid, light, layer, and layer grid. We're going to be utilizing the layer emitter type, and the reason why we're doing that is what the layer emitter type allows you to do is take a flat layer and utilize either texture information or luminosity or alpha to determine where those particles are. And then if we come down here to the layer emitter settings, you can see that we can allow the red, blue, green, or RGB of the layer to do certain things. Like the lightness can impact the size of the particles, how fast they go, how they rotate, or the RGB can do all three. We can have the layer choose the color of the particle depending on where that's emitted on that layer, or we could have it do nothing. And we're going to use nothing for this, but those are options that we can use when we're using our custom layers. Now, a custom layer could either be a texture or a layer you drop directly into the composition, or it can be a pre-comp. And in our case, we're going to use a pre-comp. So let's go ahead and make a new composition. And this time, I'm going to call this source and make the width 1500 and the height 1500. Whoops, got to unlock the ratio here. Here we go. And everything else can stay the same, and we'll click OK. Now that we have this comp in here, what I want to do is create a circle with an empty center, because we're going to emulate the look of those stars going in a circular pattern away from us and then coming back at the camera. Now there's a couple different ways that you can do this as well. You can either put a new layer on here, mask out, and use a stroke or 3D stroke from Trapcode, or you can put a circle effect, or you can manually mask out. Another way you can do it is simply by using a shape layer. So if you don't have any layers selected, you can come up here to your mask tools and you can create a new shape with some settings. Now by default you have some stuff up here that will utilize the last settings you used when you last made a layer. And for me, I didn't have any fill, but you can change that by just left clicking and selecting. And I'm going to have a white stroke with a stroke width of 150. And now what we can do is simply either drag in our comp to create it. If you hit shift, it'll make sure it stays circular. Or you can just basically hit Control Z, get out of that, and double click the ellipse tool, which will create a circle with the extent of your composition. Only problem is we're cutting off or clipping part of our circle up here, and that will look a little bit strange when we start emitting particles. So let's twirl down the ellipse dialog box here and the transform ellipse, and you can utilize really either transform to do this. So I'll just use this one. We're going to scale this back to about 85% so that our entire circle is inside of our composition. Let's hop back into our final comp and drop that in. Now since this layer or composition is 1500 pixels wide, you can see we can't really even see it inside our composition, although we can move it over and take a look. We want to leave it centered though. But what we can do is come here to our particular layer, come down here to our layer emitter settings, and change this layer from none to source. But before we do that, you got to make sure you have the source layer as a 3D layer. If not, this is what will happen. You'll get an error saying, hey dummy, make this a 3D layer. So before you have your computer tell you you're a moron, I would highly recommend you click the 3D layer switch, and what you can do is come back here, deselect it, and reselect it, and everything should be kosher. Now, one of the things that has happened is we have rotated our camera, so now this layer lays flat in this plane. We need to rotate our source by hitting the R key and rotating it on the x-axis 90 degrees so it once again lines up the right way with our camera. Alright, the next thing we need to do is start taking care of our particles. Let's leave the particles per second at 100 for now, just so we can kind of see easier what's going on without bogging the system down. And let's really increase the velocity. Let's go up to something like 1800 or so. This should shoot particles away from the camera at a pretty high rate. While we're at it, let's decrease the emitter size down to 0 and come down here to the particle settings. Now, by default, we're using the layer sampling of current time. Let's turn that to particle birth time, so it only samples particles which are the in the alpha, where it's opaque on the ring, not the black area or transparent area in the middle. We also want to increase the life of the particles. We want those up pretty high so we can see the particles throughout the entire length of the composition. And we can decrease the sphere feather so we can see them a little bit better. We'll leave the particle type at sphere, And for now, let's just leave the particle size at 5. We're going to turn this down a little bit later, but this is fine so we can see them a little easier. So we now have the particles being emitted, but we don't have the activity of the particles getting smaller. And there's a couple different ways we can handle that as well. Since this is a 3D layer, we could effectively move this source layer forward in time, or forward in position over time. So if we hit P, and we got to remember what axis we're oriented on here. So we'll just push this forward. You can see that we move in the Y direction here forward, and we're pushing forward in space with the particles being emitted. So we could either keyframe this going forward, and I'm seeing a problem here with the particles shooting downward. That's not what we want. Let's go back to our particles and figure out what is going on. Alright, there we go. Apparently we needed those shooting forward at 180 degrees, not 90 degrees. So there you have it. Those little things that, you just got to tweak as you go along. All right, so let's move these particles back to about right here. Okay, so that's about where we want them. And we'll come back here to frame 0 and we'll set a keyframe. Actually, not for the position. Let's go ahead and just do this by scale. That's a different way we can do it. Let's set a keyframe for the scale, and then come down here about 1 second in, and change this down to about 50%. So our source layer gets smaller, and the particles actually will track that, and will start emitting just like the actual layer was smaller. We don't have to worry about the particles not recognizing the scaling parameter. It will do it. So let's come down here and make it a little bit smaller, a little further in. So we'll come down here to about 1 minute and 14 frames or so, and we'll bring this down a little bit further to 34%. So it gets smaller. We'll come down here to about 2 seconds, and we're going to unscale at this time and start bringing the top and bottom in a little bit. So we'll unlink this and start decreasing this. We'll go to about half, which is 17, and then come down a lot later, give us a little more time, and take this all the way down to 0.5, which will make this a nice long thin emitter, which will mimic the look of the particles that we saw in our inspiration clip. So that's looking pretty good. The particles are doing what they want. However, we increased the velocity of the particles way up, but didn't increase the gravity. So let's go back and take care of that. We can turn off the source layer so we don't see it, and come down to the physics dialog box here, and let's see what our velocity was. It's 1800. We'll set our gravity up to 1800 to match it just to start out, to make sure this looks the way we want it to. So if we scrub through the timeline, yep, you can see what's happening. Let's take a look at this particle right here. It's being born, it's going forward, and then coming backwards, which is what we want. However, I think we want them to shoot forward a little bit more. So let's dial this up to, oh, that's gravity, hold on, 1800, and let's increase the velocity of this up to about 2000. Now they should shoot forward a little bit faster and a little bit longer, and then start peeling backwards. Good, that's what we want. Okay, we have our particles basically doing what we want, and we have the right shape and everything's going the right way, but we need to start adding in the streaks. Now once again, like everything else, there's a couple different ways that you can do this. The first way is to come down here to the rendering dialog box, and we can come down here to motion blur and turn motion blur on. By default, like I showed you in the fountain tutorial, comp settings, you can turn them on by simply using the toggle switch here in the timeline for motion blur on the layer, as well as motion blur on the entire composition. However, you're limited to using the default settings inside the composition. While you can go alter those, you might not want to do that if you want to regulate the motion blur on this layer independent of the rest of your composition. So you can change the motion blur from comp settings to on. Now by default, you're set to a linear type of motion blur, which effectively uses basically the frame to calculate where the particle was the last frame, where the particle is now, and draw a straight line through it, or linear. You can increase the shutter angle on this to make the lines longer, but if you do that, you can see the blur makes this a lot less opaque, and you can boost the opacity up and bring it back bright by increasing the opacity boost, like so. That only goes up to 100. So you can bring it all the way back up, and you can bring the shutter angle up pretty much as high as you want. But one thing you'll notice is the higher you go with the shutter angle, up to 300 or 3,600, you start getting breakups of your particles if you've got a really high velocity. And as you'll notice, what linear basically does is just create a series of particles and add those in to give the illusion of a straight line. Okay, so linear is really not going to work for us because we want some really long lines, but it's kind of getting broken up, and you can see that's really bad right there. That's not going to work for us. So we'll change the type from linear to subframe sample. Now this does another thing. It opens up our levels, and what levels are the amount of particles that particular will put in between the last particle and the first particle of your streak or your motion blur, and it allows you to control that dynamically actually, so you can increase this up. The problem is, in our case, if you have, once again, a really long streak or a high amount of motion blur or shutter angle, you cap out of your levels at 256. So that's all that you can get. So once again, you can see we're getting a little bit of breakup here on some of the high velocity particles, and it's just not what we want. Now, these look fairly good because we have really big particles, but we're not going to want the particles or the lines this size at the end. So what happens if we turn the size down from 5 to 1? What happens is you can end up still getting streaks of particles. And if we see if we can find one here, this actually is a little hard to see because you don't have, oh, here we go, right here on this corner. You can see that this is still breaking up, and that's pretty ugly. I really don't like that look because it really destroys the illusion of these stars streaking by, and you'll be able to catch this even if it's moving in motion. So this perhaps isn't the best option if you have very fast moving particles. So let's turn the motion blur off, and let's look at another thing we can utilize to create the same effect but have a lot more control over, and that is auxiliary particles. Now this is the first time that we've kind of dove into auxiliary particles, so we'll take a couple minutes to kind of explain what happens here. By default, auxiliary particles are set to off. As you know, particular has two types of physics, bounce and air. We are currently in the air physics, so bounce event won't help us. But this is available if we are in bounce physics, so we can emit auxiliary particles whenever our particles hit a wall or a floor or a layer that we define as a wall or a floor. So we'll cover that a little bit later. For now, the only one we need to concern ourselves about for air physics is continuously. And this means that the main particles that are defined above will continuously emit auxiliary particles, and they'll have the following settings. Emit probability means that every main particle, if it's set to 100, will emit auxiliary particles. Similarly, if you drop this to 50%, that means only half of the main particles emitted will emit auxiliary particles. In our case, we want that up to 100, but there may be occasions where you want only a portion of your main particles emitting these auxiliary particles. Now the next one is particles per second. If you'll notice, none of these are really keyframeable, so that's another thing to keep in mind. But particles per second is very much like the levels command or the levels dialog box in the motion blur settings for subframe sample. It's the amount of particles that are being emitted per second, which will fill in the auxiliary or the trails here, and the more you twirl up, the more solid the line becomes, and you'll already notice that we don't have any problems going over 256. I don't think I've ever really tried to cap this out, but yeah, I mean, we're up to 13,000 here, and it doesn't show any signs of stopping. So obviously we don't need that many, but you can go a lot higher than the 256 levels you can in the motion blur. So this is the reason why we're using it in this instance. Let's drop this back down to perhaps about 1500 to start with. So we still have nice solid lines. The next thing we can do is change the type, and by default you can use these particle types: sphere, which is what we're using now, a glow sphere, which doesn't have depth of field, a star, which doesn't have depth of field, a cloudlet, a streaklet, and then same as main. So if you wanted to use a custom particle or something like that, you can use the same thing as the main, or you can use something different than the main if you choose one of the default ones: sphere, glow sphere, star, cloudlet, or streaklet. We'll use same as main for now, and we'll leave it at that. Velocity we don't really need to mess with. Let's turn the size down to 1 so we get the streaks that we want. And as you can see here, we have filled this in quite nicely, and I don't really see the same type of breakup that we saw with the motion blur, even at really close particle streams here going by. So I think 1500 should work very well for us. Okay. So next thing we want to do is adjust the color, and by default you have this rainbow color where the first particle is red and the last is blue. And you come down here to the color over life settings, and let's see, it's right here. And this is what defines those particle colors. We have a couple default gradients here, which is the rainbow, black and white, blue, all these. You can do random, which is kind of interesting. You just keep clicking it. In particular, we'll just grab random 3 colors and chuck them in there. Or if you have more, you have random 5 colors, just pick a 5 color gradient and click random, and you'll get just, all kinds of different looks. So if you're just bored or can't think of what you want, you can just keep hitting random so that you can scroll through some colors and take a look at what might look good for you. For us, we're just going to actually go and use the color from main and turn that up to 100, and that will basically take the color from your main particles and use them for your auxiliary particles, or you can use just a portion of it, but we'll stick to that. You also have some individual control for the particles, like how gravity affects them, the transfer mode of those particles. We'll change that to add, and we have the opacity set to 50%. You can increase that, which will brighten those up, but I'm going to pull this back down because I want them to kind of fade a little bit as they get streaky towards us and be a little brighter in the middle, which I think was similar to the clip that we saw in the actual Stargate video there. So we'll dial that back down to 30. And maybe we'll decrease this, so we'll just introduce a little bit of a bluish hue here towards the end. Maybe dial that back to 60%. Okay. I think we're getting pretty close, but we can't really tell. We don't have enough particles. And I've purposely left the particle count fairly low so that we wouldn't get bogged down when we're scrubbing through the timeline. But now's the time when we need to increase the particles per second. So let's go ahead and crank this up by a factor of about 100 and add in a couple zeros and see what happens. Bam! We have a lot more particles. So one of the things you'll notice is we have these particles here on the end kind of like capping these, and we don't want those. Those are actually the main particles. So we can come down here, and one of the neat things about Trapcode Particular is you can decrease the size of your main particle to where it goes away, and you'll see right here the end of those streams will basically fade away. So it won't be visible, but it will still emit auxiliary particles, which is really handy when you have situations where you want to instance multiple layers of particular but have different effects going on with auxiliary particles, or have additional auxiliary particles being emitted but don't want to duplicate the main particle. So that's a nice feature to be able to turn that down to 0 but still have that emitting auxiliary particles. So we'll come back here and we'll just kind of scrub through the timeline and take a look at how this is looking, and we can adjust the length of our streaks here by adjusting some of the auxiliary particle settings. If we come down here to the auxiliary particle settings, let's maybe dial this back by 1000, push this to 2000 just so we can see. Okay, that's enough to really kind of get a look at what we're doing. We can adjust some of these. By default, the life is set to 0.5, which for us may be a little bit high. So we'll dial this back to 0.2. Now you can see we're getting that look where we have the streaks here, and then they're kind of slowing down to nothing and reversing course, which is what we want. I think we might need a little bit longer streaks here, so what we can do is increase the velocity of our main particles, and that should extend those initial streaks out a little bit more. There we go, maybe something like 3000. There. So now we've got longer streaks, then we've got that kind of a little bit of a dead zone where the particles are slowing down, and then the streaks coming back towards the camera. I also think we're getting a little bit too blue here, so let's just maybe take this back to one color. Maybe set this up with kind of a bluish gray color, like so. And this to a bluish gray color as well. be about like that. Color from main we'll leave at about 60%, so we get a little bit brighter in the middle and a little bit darker on the side, like so. Okay, the final thing I think we need to do is adjust the amount of particles over the life of our composition here. Now, at the beginning we have, a bunch of particles, but then as this kind of gets closer in our inspiration scene, we had a lot more particles being emitted. So we need to keyframe the amount of particles over time. Let's start out at about 9,000 particles, let's say, and then let's set a keyframe for the particles per second, and come down here maybe to about 2.5 seconds or so. That, and we'll hit U to reveal the keyframes on this layer, and we'll set a keyframe so we have a consistent amount of particles being emitted here, which is about 9,000. And then we'll come down here to maybe about 3 seconds or so, and we'll increase the particles up to maybe about 18,000. We'll double it, so it becomes a lot more particles being emitted here at the center, and then come down about 3.5 seconds again and decrease that all the way to 0 so those stop. Another thing I want to do is break up the particles here at the end so we kind of have them shooting a bunch of different ways, and the way we can do that is by keyframing the directional spread. So we'll come down here to about 3 seconds, and here at the emitter let's right click or left click the directional spread, leave that at 0, and we'll come down here to about 3 seconds, 8 frames, 9 frames, something like that, and let's just increase this up to about 15%, just to make these middle particles kind of shoot different ways. And if we scrub down the timeline here, you can see that we're getting the look of our inspiration clip with the really bright whites here on the edges. I think the particles might be a little bit too big, so we'll come down here to the auxiliary particle settings, and we'll dial this back to maybe 0.5 to make it a little bit smaller. There we go. Let's maybe 0.7. Just tweak this till we're happy with the color. I think that looks a lot better. Alright, and as one final little thing or touch, I want to make this kind of look like time-space is being bent a little bit. So we don't want quite such a linear look. So what I'm going to do is add a new adjustment layer. I couldn't spit it out there. And we'll add Effect, Distort, Optical Compensation. Now this filter is usually used to take out optical distortion from either still images or video, where you get kind of a little bit of a bulge in the middle, and you can dial this back so that everything lines up the right way for compositing, like I don't know, 3D imagery or CGI. But what we're going to do is reverse the lens distortion and basically pull the center, leave the center the same, and pull the sides outward by adjusting the field of view here. What's going to happen is if we increase this, you can see that we're pulling the sides towards the camera a little bit. So it just changes a little bit the look of the composition enough to give it kind of a unique perspective as opposed to what you might otherwise think you'll be getting here. So scrub through the timeline. It takes a little while to render, but I think we're getting the look of our inspiration clip, and I think it looks quite good. Let's pause this. I'll do a quick frame preview and hop right back. And here we go. Let's take a quick look. I think that's pretty close to the inspiration clip. We have the same kind of effect with the stars flying forward. Let's stop it right here. You can see right here pretty clearly we've got the inner ring that we're looking for, the kind of dead area around the ring, and then the stars coming back towards us, which I think is pretty much exactly what the main clip or the original clip had. Now you can obviously dress this up however you want it. You could add stuff like maybe a glow to the stars. We can try that. Effect, stylize, glow, and tweak those settings so that you get a little bit of a softer look if that's kind of what you want, which I think that looks pretty good. Maybe you want to change the color of the glow a little bit, so instead of original colors we'll go A and B, change color A to kind of a light blue, and B to a blue as well. There we go. Give us kind of a bluish look which is kind of cool. Or if you have the Trapcode suite, another thing you could do is file or go ahead and turn on Trapcode Shine and pop that in. Change the transfer mode to add, so you can create some streaks here, and then you can come down here to the colorize section and change this from the 3-color gradient here to maybe electric if you wanted that blue look, or if you want to keep it a little bit lighter, you can dial in your own kind of aquamarine-ish color just to tweak that back a little bit. Might be a little bit overpowering, like that, and then decrease the ray length a little bit until you kind of just slightly colorize your scene. Let's do another quick RAM preview, see how this looks. And here we go. I personally think this looks a little cooler because you get a little bit of color bleeding out there. I think it just adds a little bit to the composition. You can make whatever modifications you want to get the look that you want and tweak it to your little heart's content. You can download this project file here at creativecow.net and really get under the hood, make some changes, and see what exactly Trapcode Particular is capable of, especially when it comes to these types of particle effects. As always, if you have any questions or comments, you can leave them in the comment section of this tutorial. I'll be sure to answer them as best I can, or you can usually find me lurking or hosting the Trapcode forum here at creativecow.net, and you can post a question there, and I'll do my best to answer that as quickly as I can. Once again, I want to say thank you so much for watching this tutorial. Stay tuned in the future for some new tutorials on Trapcode Particular basic training. Until next time, this is Michael Park for creativecow.net.